When you look at the Colosseum, the ruins of the Roman Forum, or the sprawling aqueducts that span the European continent, you are looking at the monuments of an empire. But beneath the marble and the grand triumphal arches lies a dark, uncomfortable truth. Rome was not built by the genius of its engineers or the valor of its legions alone. It was built on the backs, blood, and bones of millions of slaves. In the ancient Mediterranean, slavery was not a marginal practice, but the very foundation of the Roman world. Scholars estimate that at the peak of the Roman Empire, up to 1/3 of the population of Italy was enslaved. This was not just a society that had slaves, it was a slave society, an economy entirely dependent on human chattel. From the dark depths of the silver mines to the imperial palaces, slaves powered every aspect of Roman civilization. The daily life of a free Roman citizen was entirely enabled by the constant, unremitting labor of the unfree. This is the story of the Roman slave economy, the engine that drove an empire and the horrific cost paid by those who fueled it. To maintain a slave economy of this scale, Rome required a constant, massive supply of new human beings. The primary source of this supply was relentless, aggressive military conquest. Every victory by the Roman legions was followed by the systematic rounding up of the defeated population. When Rome finally destroyed its great rival Carthage in 146 BCE, over 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Decades later, during Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, historians estimate that over 1 million Gauls were captured and sent south. In addition to formal warfare, state-sanctioned piracy and kidnapping along the Mediterranean coasts kept the slave markets constantly supplied. The slave trade was so lucrative that specialized slave dealers, known as mangones, followed the legions directly into battle. These dealers bought captives in bulk from the soldiers, often trading cheap wine or basic supplies for human lives. From the borders of Scotland to the sands of Mesopotamia, Rome's expanding frontiers functioned as a massive funnel, draining conquered lands of their people. Once captives arrived in Italy, the vast majority were sent to work in the fields. The wealth of the Roman elite was primarily in land, and this land was organized into massive agricultural estates called Latifundia. These estates specialized in cash crops like wine, olive oil, and grain, destined for the markets of Rome. Because slaves were cheap and abundant, wealthy landowners realized they could maximize profits by using slave labor instead of hiring free citizens. Free Roman farmers, unable to compete with the low production costs of the Latifundia, were driven off their ancestral lands. This displacement transformed the Italian countryside, replacing self-sufficient family farms with industrial-scale slave plantations. On these estates, agricultural slaves worked in chain gangs, supervised by brutal overseers who were often freedmen or trusted slaves themselves. At night, many agricultural slaves were locked in ergastula, damp, semi-subterranean prison blocks chained to the walls to prevent escape. The Roman writer Varro famously categorized agricultural slaves not as human beings, but as articulate tools, living instruments of farming. While life on the Latifundia was brutal, it paled in comparison to the horror of the state-run silver and gold mines. In the region of Hispania, today's Spain, the Roman state operated massive mining complexes that produced the silver for Rome's coinage. Mining was essentially a death sentence for the slaves sent there, reserved for those who committed crimes or were deemed disposable. Slaves worked in narrow, suffocating tunnels deep underground, illuminated only by small clay lamps. The air was filled with toxic dust, lead fumes, and smoke, causing severe respiratory diseases within months. To maximize extraction, Roman overseers forced young children into the narrowest crevices where adults could not fit. The mining shafts were prone to collapse, burying workers alive, while water had to be constantly pumped out using Archimedes' screws turned by hand. Slaves worked shifts lasting 24 hours a day, kept awake and moving by the whips of overseers. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus wrote that the mine workers literally died in their tracks, their bodies worn out by the sheer physical misery of their labor. Not all slaves in Rome faced the horrors of the mines or the fields. Some lived in the urban center. The household of a wealthy Roman aristocrat, the domus, could contain dozens, sometimes hundreds, of slaves. These domestic slaves performed every conceivable chore, from cooking and cleaning to dressing and bathing their masters. Many were subjected to extreme psychological degradation, forced to stand mute for hours as human footstools or torchbearers. However, the most highly valued slaves were those with specialized skills or education. Many of Rome's doctors, teachers, accountants, architects, and administrators were actually enslaved Greeks. These educated slaves were highly prized assets, purchased at exorbitant prices to manage their masters' businesses and educate their children. Even actors, gladiators, and musicians were frequently owned as property, their talents exploited for public entertainment. Yet, despite their comfortable surroundings, these elite slaves were still subject to the absolute whim of their masters. A slight mistake, like spilling wine or misplacing a document, could result in immediate flogging, demotion to the fields, or execution. The trade of human beings was a highly organized, professional industry in the ancient Mediterranean. The largest hub of this trade was the island of Delos in the Aegean Sea. At its peak, Delos was a massive open-air slave market capable of processing and trading 10,000 people in a single day. In Rome itself, auctions were held daily near the Temple of Castor in the Forum. Captives were stood naked on wooden platforms known as catasti, so buyers could inspect their bodies for defects. Slaves from abroad had their feet whitened with chalk to indicate their origin, and were forced to wear signs detailing their skills, health, and behavior. If the seller guaranteed the slave's character, they wore a cap called a pileus. If not, the buyer purchased them at their own risk. Families were routinely torn apart at these auctions, sold to different buyers with no regard for their relationships. The Roman state taxed these sales heavily, collecting import duties and sales taxes that funded the imperial treasury. This system ensured that the state itself had a direct financial interest in the continuation of the human trade. Under Roman law, the status of a slave was defined with clinical, chilling precision. Slaves were legally classified as res, things or property, rather than persons. A master held the power of patria potestas over his household, which included the ius vitae necisc, the right of life and death. This meant a master could legally torture, mutilate, or execute a slave without any legal consequences. If a master was murdered in his home, Roman law dictated that every slave in the household was to be executed regardless of their innocence. This law was brutally enforced. In one famous case, 400 household slaves were executed after their master was killed by one individual. Slaves who tried to escape were branded on the forehead with the letters fug for fugitivus, or forced to wear heavy iron collars with messages promising a reward for their return. Because they had no legal rights, a slave's testimony in court was only admissible if it was obtained under torture. The law was designed to ensure absolute submission through the systematic application of state-sanctioned terror. The history of the ancient world is often written by the victors, but we believe in telling the stories of those who paid the price. If you want to support our mission to bring these forgotten histories to light, please take a moment to subscribe to Unshackled History. Hit the like button and leave a comment below to help others discover this documentary. Your engagement helps us keep these historical narratives free and accessible to everyone. Despite the extreme measures used to control them, the enslaved population did not always suffer in silence. Between 135 and 71 BCE, Rome was shaken by three massive uprisings known as the Servile Wars. The first two occurred in Sicily, where massive concentrations of agricultural slaves rose up, defeating several Roman armies before being crushed. But the third and most famous rebellion began in 73 BCE at a gladiatorial school in Capua. A Thracian gladiator named Spartacus, along with 70 fellow fighters, escaped using kitchen knives and makeshift weapons. Spartacus's forces quickly grew to over 120,000 escaped slaves, ravaging the Italian countryside. For 2 years, Spartacus outmaneuvered and defeated Rome's finest legions, striking terror into the hearts of the Roman Senate. The fear of a slave revolt was a constant anxiety for the Roman elite, who knew they were outnumbered in their own homes. The rebellion was finally crushed in 71 BCE by the combined forces of Crassus and Pompey. To send a warning to any future rebels, the Romans crucified 6,000 survivors along the Appian Way, from Capua to the gates of Rome. The rotting bodies on the crosses lined the highway for miles, a gruesome testament to the price of defiance. Unlike some other slave-owning societies, Rome practiced the freeing of slaves, known as manumission, on a large scale. A master could free a slave as a reward for long service, as a public display of generosity, or in their will. Many slaves were also allowed to earn money in their spare time, building up a savings fund called a peculium to buy their own freedom. Once freed, the former slave became a libertus, or freedman. While freedmen were not granted full citizenship and still oversaw deference and services to their former masters, their children were born as full citizens. This system created a dynamic class of self-made individuals who often came to dominate Roman commerce and finance. Some freedmen, like Narcissus and Pallas under the Emperor Claudius, became the wealthiest and most powerful administrators in the entire empire. However, manumission was not entirely altruistic. It acted as a safety valve, giving slaves a glimmer of hope that kept them cooperative. As the empire grew, a few intellectual voices began to question the absolute brutality of the slave system. The Stoic philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, urged his fellow Romans to treat their slaves with humanity. In his famous letters to Lucilius, Seneca argued that slaves were fellow human beings, made of the same flesh and breathing the same air. He advised masters to live familiarly with their slaves, converse with them, and dine with them, rather than treating them like beasts. Similarly, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a devout Stoic, enacted laws that placed minor restrictions on the absolute power of masters. Yet neither Seneca nor Marcus Aurelius ever called for the abolition of slavery. To the Stoics, physical slavery was irrelevant compared to the slavery of the mind. They believed one could be a slave, yet internally free. This philosophical view allowed the Roman elite to justify the system's existence, easing their consciences while maintaining their wealth. The philosophical discussion of humane treatment was a luxury for the rich, while the daily life of slaves remained a nightmare. The reality for the vast majority of slaves remained unchanged, a wide gulf separating philosophical ideals from daily suffering. The engine of Roman slavery was ultimately powered by expansion, and when the expansion stopped, the system began to collapse. By the 2nd century CE, under the Emperor Hadrian, the frontiers of the empire were stabilized and conquest came to an end. With no new lands being conquered, the supply of cheap captives dried up, causing the price of slaves to skyrocket. Roman landowners could no longer afford to replace dead agricultural workers with cheap replacements from the markets. To keep their estates productive, landowners had to rely on free tenant farmers, known as colony. Over time, the state bound these colony to the land by law, preventing them from leaving their plots to ensure tax revenue. This legal shift marked the slow, centuries-long transition from the classic slave economy to the feudal system of medieval Europe. The chattel slave was gradually replaced by the medieval serf, bound not to a master, but to the soil. The grand architecture of Rome still stands today, a testament to the power and ambition of the ancient world. But we must never forget that every stone was laid, every road paved, and every coin minted by hands that were bound in chains. If you found this exploration of the Roman slave economy eye-opening, please hit the like button. Share this video with history enthusiasts and subscribe to Unshackled History to join us in uncovering the truth. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next chapter of our journey through history.